All right, let's go ahead and get started. So welcome to the November 2025 Lunch and Learn. We are just a couple of housekeeping reminders. We do record these presentations, and then the presentations are available on our YouTube page. So please check out if there's any um, previous previous topics you might want to go back and watch. I will say though, when we get to the end of the presentation and we have discussion, that part of the presentation will not be posted up on YouTube. We like to cut off the recording there just so we can have an open discussion and you can share things and feel comfortable to do that. So, just a reminder there. Okay, so if you don't know me, but I think most of you probably do, I'm Erin Norton. I'm the director of the Midwest Grape and Wine Industry Institute here at Iowa State. And today, the topic I think is quite timely, reductive aromas in wine. Next month in December, I'm going to talk a little bit about dissolved oxygen in wine. And so the two kind of go together. Even the one we just covered in October when Sarah covered nutrients kind of leads right into this idea of reductive aromas in wine. Going to be honest, it's a complex topic. It's there's a lot of chemistry in oxidation and reduction, and so I will try to keep it kind of high level and what you need to know as winemakers, uh, but yeah, just know that this is not always an easy topic to get your head around. Reduction, oxidation, and the chemistry behind it. Even for chemists. I mean, I was a chemistry major, a master's in chemistry, and this was probably one that always kind of confused me to some degree. So let's jump into this and see what smelly things we're gonna talk about today. Oh, I gotta get this. Here we go. So, what are reductive aromas? They're aromas from compounds that are reduced in wine, and they come from a variety of sources, but most likely, and most of them are caused by sulfur-containing compounds. So, there's something to do with sulfur chemistry. It's really linked with amino acid chemistry within the wine, and it's also uh, in heavily involved in the fermentation. But we can all go all the way back to the vineyard and things we do in the vineyard to affect some of these reductive type aromas. So sulfur-containing compounds, that's mainly what we're going to be talking about today. Um, Normally, a lot of these compounds are very smelly. Rotten egg is one of the ones that we think of mainly. Cabbage, if it progresses, it can lead to smelling like cabbage or rubber. Garlic and onion is when it gets that far, we're really having some problems in our wine. And some of these things you might think, well, garlic and onion don't smell that bad. Trust me, in wine, you do not want a garlic and onion smell. It's not pleasant. It's so we want to prevent these things as much as possible. There's a couple of intervention methods that we can use if we start smelling these things. But prevention, and I've said this on other lunch and learns, prevention is key. Okay, so some of the chemistry behind it. I can't go through the whole presentation and not show you a little bit of where the chemistry is coming from. And it what I'm always trying to do with some of these lunch and learns, but or other presentations, is just to make us more thoughtful winemakers. And if we can understand from the basics where some of these issues or are coming from with the chemistry, um, sometimes we can understand how to generate change or fix things or be preventative or things like that. So the chemistry behind reduction or redox chemistry, reduction and oxidation chemistry, is really all about electrons moving around between molecules that are in the wine. Wine is full of a whole range of different types of chemicals, and reactions happen. Lots of reactions happen, and because of that, we can get compounds or molecules exchanging electrons, and that's a type of reaction. So you may remember from high school level chemistry, Leo the Lion says Gur or oil rig, depending. I learned Leo the Lion says Gur. But basically, they're the same. They're the same thing. Loss of electrons is oxidation. A gain of electrons is reduction. So when we're talking about reductive aromas, those molecules gained some electrons and were changed chemically. Um, excuse me. And so if we just look at this figure over here, I'm going to put my little laser pointer on the right-hand side. H2S is sulfur in its fully reduced form. So that's where we're talking about these reductive types of aromas. H2S, this rotten egg. That's kind of the first thing we start to smell. SO2 in the middle is a more neutral form of sulfur, and it does smell like struck flint or a struck match. But if we oxidize SO2 all the way, we're going to get to a clean smell, which would be sulfate. Okay, SO4 2 minus is sulfate, and it essentially doesn't have a smell. So these are just the same um, sulfur element in its fully reduced and then its fully oxidized form. So when we talk about dissolved oxygen a little bit next month, I might revisit reduction versus oxidation. So some of the aromas though that we're talking about, we've got our H2S, that's the fully reduced form of sulfur, but there's all kinds of other pieces and bits of molecules in wine that can react further. When you have small molecules like this, a lot of times they can still react. So if a little group like a methyl group attaches, we have an SH. That's the important part. If you still have that SH portion, you have a thiol or a mercaptan. Same thing. Okay, thiol, mercaptan, same thing, just a different name. Um, and if we add some oxygen in there and go even further, we can get to things like disulfides, which is where this onion and garlic comes into play. The further along we go along this pathway, the harder it is for us to deal with. So this is why I say prevention is key, and prevention and dealing with this H2S is where we need to be focused. Where does the H2S even come from, though? During fermentation, there's sulfur we use in the vineyard, so there's sulfur in these plants. That's normal. There's a little bit of sulfur in these plants, and a lot of times, if the metabolism is healthy in yeast, so they're going through their fermentation and it's very healthy, they can use up some of that sulfur to create some amino acids. There's amino acids that require that have sulfur in them. And so if all that is going well, you won't have any problems. If there's some issues within that production of those sulfur-containing amino acids, then we can start to see some H2S. So it's really about keeping those yeast healthy and happy and having them do all the things that they need to do so that then they can turn around and eat up the sugar and create alcohol. They're doing more than just eating sugar and creating alcohol. There's all kinds of other things happening in a yeast cell during fermentation. Okay, so different types of sulfur compounds. I mentioned a couple of them. There's sulfides, there's mercaptans, there's disulfides. There's a lot of words on this slide. I do highly recommend come back to the video later and hit pause and kind of look at this. But these are the different types of sulfur compounds we get. There's different kinds of aromas they give. So sulfides can give you those cooked vegetables, those canned vegetable type aromas. The mercaptans and thiols, the cabbage and burnt rubber. And then the disulfides, they're the trickiest ones. Onion, garlic, cooked cabbage again. And just a little bit about where these things come from and how stable they really are. And again, these disulfides are really tricky for us to deal with in a winemaking sense. Okay, so let's move on. Why does reduction happen? So it's all about redox, reduction oxidation, and the balance between um, all of the different components in wine. There's lots of components, lots of molecules in wine that are reactive, and with the low pH that we have, and lots of things floating around, it's we should expect that reactions will take place. And depending if we're in a reductive environment or an oxidative environment, that's where you would get either of these types of molecules being made. So redox balance is really a chemical tug of war between the oxidizing agents and reducing agents that are within the wine. And that essentially just means which ones are more reactive at any one point in time. We want to remain in balance. We kind of want to remain in balance in terms of that redox potential. It's challenging because there are things that happen that naturally just drop the redox potential or raise the redox potential. Okay, or there are things that happen in wine that we do that shift it one way or the other. So we need to know what those are so that we can monitor and make sure that things are okay. So common causes of reduction. Limited oxygen exposure during fermentation or aging. So I know we always consider wine fermentation to be anaerobic. Okay, so there should be no oxygen present. Well, actually, a little bit of oxygen is good for those yeast. It's good for them. They uh, it keeps this redox potential in check. It's healthy for them to get a little bit of oxygen. We do that with our red wines. You're pumping over or punching down. That bit of oxygen introduction is a good thing. And so in our white wines, we might want to consider, at the very least, smelling them when we're doing our bricks checks every day and make sure they're not going towards a reductive state and starting to smell H2S and whatnot. So nutrient deficiencies or an excess of sulfur addition, maybe in the vineyard, maybe up front at the beginning of fermentation, that SO2 can get reduced during the fermentation, so you don't want to have too much in there. But nutrient deficiencies, I'll come back to. That's where we're talking about our YAN, our yeast assimilable nitrogen. Yeast strain selection and fermentation kinetics. So you almost every yeast manufacturer or supplier, I should say, yeast suppliers will tell you if a specific yeast is high nitrogen requiring or low nitrogen requiring. And you can use whichever one you want, but just know whether it needs a lot of nutrients or not. And then fermentation kinetics. We don't want ferments to get too slow because that's exactly when you start to smell H2S is when they are struggling. The yeast are struggling and they slow down. Or on the opposite side, if they go too fast, there is a likelihood of some H2S production. So there's a happy medium. A lot of people, just thinking about the round tables that we have, 7 to 10 days of fermentation is very reasonable. I would say both on the whites and the reds. Sometimes the whites can take a little longer, up to 2 weeks, and that's pretty normal. Um, you're pushing it by going in either direction. I mean, it might work, and it depends on your yeast choice, your yeast assimilable nitrogen. So I'm not saying that that's the absolute, but I would say 7 to 10 days is kind of the average that a lot of people that I've heard anecdotally. Okay, so what winemaking stages are at risk for developing reduction? And I want to just bring in one anecdote. So at this year's Iowa State Fair wine competition, I was asked to be a judge, and I was somewhat of a special kind of judge. And when the table of judges was done with their wines, if a wine received no medal, it would come to me and I would do a sensory evaluation and decide if there were any faults present or not. And that way we could make up a set of notes for each winemaker for wines that they sent in that received no medal, just to give some feedback. And not all of them were faulted. Most of them, I would say. But overwhelmingly, the fault in bottle and is not reduction. The fault in bottle is oxidation. The fault post fermentation is usually reduction. So that during primary fermentation and then just after that primary fermentation, which is kind of where we're probably at right now, is where we're probably going to see some reduction, some reductive notes. And just know that over the course of the rest of your winemaking, you can be hyper vigilant and do everything in a very reductive way, and not introduce any oxygen. Um, but in general, I would say you are going to pick up little bits of oxygen um, during the rest of winemaking. Does that mean you shouldn't do anything about it? No, no, because if you, like I said, if you get to the disulfide stage with garlic and onion before you do much more winemaking, you're going to be in a pickle. So you may still need to act early, but I'm just saying that you tend to see different at different time points the different faults. So primary fermentation, this is if your yeast are nutrient deficient, they don't have enough yeast assimilable nitrogen, and then you can they can produce H2S. So that can happen from, some of the fruit can come into the winery with high sulfur residues from sprays. But it also might just be a lack of fertilization in the vineyard. Plants that maybe aren't as healthy are coming in with low yan as well. You can and there's I've got some prevention strategies in an upcoming slide, so I'll talk about, what your options are in that point. But nicely, we do actually have the option of adding in nitrogen at the winery. It's not like in the vineyard is our only place that we can supplement with some yeast nutrient. And then low oxygen environments, primary fermentation, we're trying to get out oxygen, right? It's anaerobic. Our yeast are anaerobic. So so we risk going into reduction at that stage. Post-fermentation aging. So when the yeast die, they tend to shift the redox balance quite a bit. And they tend to, let's say, suck all of the dissolved oxygen out of the wine. And because of that, you've got a reductive environment in your wine right after fermentation as those yeast die and settle out. So you might start picking up H2S or some other sulfur-containing compounds at that point. Reductive storage conditions in tank and in bottle under screw cap. We're taught as winemakers, don't let oxygen in. Do not let oxygen in. No headspace. Seal your tanks. And yeah, that's very true, except if you're in a very reductive environment and you've got these things present these molecules present that can give you some reductive notes. So, on that note, taste your wine often and see how it's evolving. And then bottling and storage, small amounts of H2S or thiols can further be reduced in the bottle, especially if you are under screw cap or you've been really careful about your oxygen uptake during bottling. You can create an environment that's reductive in bottle or in can. I will talk about cans for a second or in a minute. Sensory detection. Volatile sulfur containing compounds have very low sensory thresholds, meaning a small amount of them and we can smell them. We talk a lot about acetic acid as being a fault that we see a lot. The sensory threshold in acetic acid is way high. It's nearly 1 gram per liter, and these are probably down in the microgram, even lower, microgram per liter or nanogram per liter, and then you can start to pick up sulfur-containing compounds. So, so that's a challenge because even just little amounts are gonna make our wine smelly. Um, I just included because sometimes you might see the names of compounds if you're looking on the internet and trying to, if you see some academic articles, they might provide the names of some of these molecules. So I recommend regularly checking your tanks during and after fermentation for these off aromas. I will say on the lab side of this, it's very challenging for us to pick these up with our lab equipment. We have a gas chromatography mass spec here, and even there are ones in the world that can pick up these types of compounds in such low concentrations, but very expensive, and we don't have one. So, and I would say most food labs don't necessarily have one. Um, so we need to use our own noses. That's my point. We need to use our own noses to be recognizing and diagnosing volatile sulfur compounds. And if there's something you think might be a little off and you're not quite sure, get somebody else. Somebody else might be more sensitive than you, and yeah, use each other's noses to diagnose some of these problems. Prevention strategies. So, yeast nutrient management. So, YAN, talking about yeast assimilable nitrogen. I highly recommend you test your YAN. It's something you may need to send into a lab like us. Our lab can do this analysis no problem. Labs like ETS and things like that. There's a couple other labs around the Midwest that could do this. You want to be at about 150 to 250. I would say there's a lot of winemakers, I think, that just add YAN, add either Fermaid K or DAP or some form of a yeast nutrient as a recipe. And they say, oh, I'm just going to add this every year. You don't want to add too much. This year was a little bit more wet, at least where we were. And in a lot of parts of Iowa, we were a little more wet. And YAN typically and was compared to some sites we analyzed last year was quite a bit higher this year, just naturally because of some of those wet conditions. So we do highly recommend. Do you have to measure everything? No. If your vineyard you've got multiple cultivars, choose maybe 2 whites, 2 reds to test, or get a baseline at least of how your vineyard is doing that year. Fertilizer in the vineyard can improve YAN. There's evidence of that. Lots of published articles on that. We are doing a project here using Edelweiss and Marquette here in Iowa, and we're going to see what impact either fertilizing in the vineyard versus adding YAN in the winery, what impact that has on the final wines. So stay tuned for that, those results. We can do winery nitrogen additions, though. That's a good thing. There's lots of products out there. Fermate K, Fermate O, DAP are the main ones, diammonium phosphate. Um, there are some others as well that are more organic based yeast nutrients. There's like a stimula. Um, Fresh Protect doesn't add any yan. You really need to, if you go into whatever supplier you prefer, make sure you know whether it's adding yan or not. There's lots of yeast nutrient out there. Some of it does not add yan. It gives you something else that can help boost the yeast. Make sure if your goal is to add yeast assimilable nitrogen, that you're picking a product that adds yeast assimilable nitrogen. Oxygen management and controlled aeration. I say that with a very heavy caveat of please be careful. It is when it's control when I say controlled aeration, it's you need special equipment to do this. Okay, microoxygenation should not be messed with, and I'm not really sure how our cultivars will support microoxygenation. Um, but aeration at the beginning of fermentation and splash racking during fermentation to blow off some of that H2S, good idea. Um, don't splash rack after. You are creating a perfect environment for chemical species to start reacting with each other, and you're going to get those higher sulfides. Post fermentation, do not splash rack. Um, you can do low amounts of oxygen introduction right, directly after fermentation. And that can help alleviate some of the H2S, but uh, low amounts and controlled, not a vigorous splash racking. Proper sulfur dioxide management and timing. Use accurate pH and molecular SO2 calculations. So make sure you know what your pH is to accurately dose in your SO2. And monitor your SO2 regularly. I think that is um, always something that we recommend. Also, rack off your heavy lees post fermentation quickly. That those heavy lees are going to add in lots of smelly things after a while. And so if you're trying to preserve wines in a fresh way and you want to preserve those fruity characters, get them off of the heavy lees. And I would even say probably do a second racking um, relatively quickly because a lot settles out in that first little bit post fermentation. Corrective action. So this is intervention at this point. We've talked about prevention, intervention now. You could do copper fining. Um, Copper fining should be used as a last resort, I would say. There is a very low limit of copper allowed in wine. Copper is very toxic. And so the TTB is very careful, and there's a very low amount that is allowed to be in wine. So the regulation says you can add up to 6 ppm, but the residual at the time of bottling needs to be at 1 ppm. So I would never, ever, in fact, I'm going to do this. I'm going to cross out never, ever, ever add 6 ppm. Um, if you need to add slightly above 1 ppm, that's fine, but you need to be very careful. And if you add above 1 ppm, the TTB does require or does you need to have documentation that you have tested and your residual is at 1 ppm. So be very careful with adding copper. You're adding copper as a copper sulfate solution. You can purchase solutions already made up. We have a really good extension fact sheet. And for some reason, I'm thinking that number is not correct, and it's 40. Either way, there is a what's it called? A link at the end of this to the extension store, and you can look up copper tr finding trials. Um, and that document actually has a lot of good information about using copper and how to complete the finding trial. These are just some of the tables from the finding trials. So you're going to you really, I recommend doing bench trials for anything you're going to add into a wine just to see what it's going to do and how much you really need to add. You really need to do this for your copper finding. You really need to find out what is the lowest amount possible to achieve um, the reduction in aromas that you are looking for. When you do your bench trials, smell only. Don't taste these things. You're putting copper in there. They're smell only, aroma only. Um, and there are some other things that can help. Ascorbic acid, if you're at the garlic onion stage or getting there, ascorbic acid can help. And in within that document the extension fact sheet, it talks about how to add the ascorbic acid and how to do bench trials for those. Um, like I said before, during fermentation, active fermentation, you can do some splash racking. You can use microoxygenation, but like I said, in late fermentation or early aging, but you need a whole set of equipment to control the amount of oxygen you're adding. This is not just bubbling through a stone. This is a controlled amount of oxygen that you want to add into your wine. So there is more to it. And like I said before, I'm not really sure how our cultivars um, if they have the potential to use microoxygenation. I have some questions about that. But blending is also a good option here. If you've got a little bit of stinkiness, instead of using copper and getting into that, you could blend with another wine to reduce the concentration of those compounds. So copper fining, a lot of people rely on it. Just be very careful because there are strict regulations and you really, really do need to do a bench trial. The nice thing is, though, you're just adding in a small amount of copper sulfate and you're waiting 5 to 10 minutes to see how it smells. You're not having to do, when you're doing bentonite bench trials and heating it and having to let it cool um, and then evaluating. This is relatively quick. Okay. Closure and packaging effects. So after fermentation or after all this winemaking, there are effects that we can see in terms of which closures we might be using. Like I said, most of the wines that I see around the Midwest or see in Iowa at least are more on the oxidative side, but it is totally possible. Maybe after this talk or after, you know, we're moving probably towards more reductive techniques, and we may see some reductive wines in the near future. But so screw caps versus corks, different corks or different closures allow different amounts of oxygen ingress during aging. Typically, screw cap doesn't let any. There are some special ones you can buy that have a little bit, but I would say I'm not sure if anyone's really using those in the Midwest. So screw caps typically don't let any oxygen in. They're reductive in nature. Natural corks let a little bit of oxygen in. Synthetic corks tend to let more oxygen in. And so that's a choice for you as winemakers, whichever one you want to use, but just knowing how the wine you put into bottle may change over the course of its life before it's enjoyed by whoever. Um, So closure selection, you should think about what wine style. I mean, I know that's not always perfect because a lot of times we're doing things based on, all of my wines go under a screw cap because it's easier to do the same thing and have one piece of equipment. But do consider storage time and SO2 management when you're putting those things into their packaging. And how much SO2? Do you want high or low SO2 if you're going to use a screw cap? I would say low. You can get away with using lower amounts of SO2. If you're using a synthetic cork, you may want to boost up the amount of SO2 you're adding. So best practices, bottle under inert gas. Um, you should evaluate total package oxygen, which I'll talk about next month about dissolved oxygen and how we measure that. And then consider your storage temperature as well. I wanted to mention canned wines because there's been a lot of work in the academic world on this, and it was canned wines, I think, have gained some momentum. I'm not sure if everybody's jumped on the bandwagon, but there is an increased risk of H2S or reductive type aromas in cans, even with a can lining. And it's wines that white wines and rosés tend to be at a greater risk. And that is, or the suggestion is that's because they have lower pH and higher SO2 available. And the SO2 is actually being reduced by the aluminum itself, even with a can liner. The can liners are not perfect. And so that's an interesting result. And so the recommendation is that if you are going to use cans for your wine packaging, you should do that for products that are going to sell really quickly and be drank really quickly. You don't want those things sitting around on a shelf and not consumed because they time just increases the risk of reductive aromas. Um, so that was out of some work by the Sachs group in Cornell, and they're still looking at all of these things. So stay tuned a little bit, but cans are a little bit problematic when it comes to reductive aromas. So I wanted to point out as well, sulfur-containing compounds aren't all bad. I'm talking about some bad ones, yes. Some of them, we talk about thiols being nice and fruity. So there are some thiols out there that we want and we want to keep and we want to safeguard against and some of those other bad ones. So there are some that are give grapefruit or citrus peel or tropical type aromas. So not all sulfur components are bad. Some people say that slight reduction can add a minerality to the wine, and there are some styles out there in the world like Chablis or Sancerre, both in France, where they are probably made in a more reductive style, and that's what people expect out of them now. I think here in the Midwest, we should be aiming for fresh and fruity. Our cultivars have a lot of fruit forward characteristics, and that's what we should be trying to achieve. Um, yeah, and excessive reduction masks the fresh and fruitiness. So sometimes if you can't pick out some of those distinct aromas, but you know there's a lack in fruitiness compared to other years, go and find someone else, get their opinion, but you may have a reduction issue. There's a really quick and easy way to see if it clears up, and I think, did I have it on a slide yet? Yeah, I did. Drop a penny in your wine glass and see if that improves the wine. And if it does, you may have some of these sulfur components that maybe some copper would benefit the wines. Prevention is always best, but intervention is up to you as a winemaker. When do you want to intervene? How do you want to intervene? Why are you intervening? Is it, to increase the longevity in your bottles, or because you're going to can, so you want to do something? So just think about it, Oh, should I really add copper? Is this the best thing that I should do for the wine? So again, just trying to make everybody thoughtful winemakers, and I'm happy to walk through scenarios with you if you want to call and talk things through. But it's ultimately it's all up to you and how you want to treat your wines. So the take-home message, reduction and reductive aromas should be managed. And when I say managed, at the very least should be you should taste them and taste your wines and make sure that things aren't evolving in a way that you don't want them to. Um, Preserve freshness and fruitiness of hybrid grape cultivars. That's my recommendation. If you've done things in a different way and you want a minerality to your wine and you like that, that's absolutely fine. That's the great thing about being a winemaker is that we get to be creative in how we make these wines. There are some preventative methods, making sure your wines have good yan concentrations. And you can do that either in the vineyard with fertilization. That's not the only benefit, I guess, to fertilizing, but we do see that when fertilizers are applied appropriately, you typically have good yan in the fruit that comes into the winery. Or there are winery additions if need be. And yeast selection. If reductive aromas are a problem for you, I would also look at what yeast you are using to see if you want to switch it up a little bit. There's intervention methods. So I talked about copper sulfate fining and blending, um, both things that you can use to help some of these wines. And then think about redox balance during winemaking. If I do this, am I introducing oxygen? Am I removing oxygen? And if you think that's a good idea or not. I think the first thing is to actually think about it, and then and then we'll just again be more thoughtful winemakers about whether all the practices we're doing are a good idea or not. So, before we get into our discussion, just a quick mention. Our website there has a lot of information on it. My contact information, as well as Sarah Purtle. She is our education and outreach specialist and is working with a lot of winemakers and cider makers and brewers now um, on various issues they may have. If you're in Iowa, she can come out and visit and see what's happening at your locations. Um, but yeah, please reach out to us if you have a question. Extension store publications, they're all at this website here. And see, I'm not sure if it's 40 or 41. I'll be totally honest. Double check though. You can do a search and just say copper and wine or copper wine. And the copper sulfate finding trial will pop up, and a really good document that some previous colleagues wrote with how to do those bench trials and walk you through them, but also explain why you're doing what you're doing. In Lunch and Learn, we'll have our December Lunch and Learn on December 1st. We'll talk about dissolved oxygen. January, the topic to be determined, but please send us topics if you have suggestions. I have a couple suggestions for the new year already, but we love when you guys send in questions or suggestions. We are having some winemaker roundtables in Eastern Iowa. So December 9th will be at Park Farm. December 10th will be at Walker Homestead. More than welcome. Anybody is more than welcome to attend those. We're asking people to bring unfinished wine examples, so tank samples, and we're going to sit around and talk a little bit about how we made them and if people have specific questions and want some suggestions or things like that. And I just also wanted to plug the Iowa Wine Growers Association conference. We're changing up the date a little bit this year, March 23rd and 24th. So we're going to try and avoid some winter weather there. And we're actually going to be out at Oscar Carl Winery on the western side of the state, so Sioux City. So if anyone is close to that and would like to join us, maybe Nebraska or Minnesota or South Dakota, you're absolutely welcome. And maybe in December and January, I'll have more details if there's, I'm not sure when registration is opening, but I can find that out for you. So on that note, I'm going to stop. There's a couple of chat notes. It's 41. Okay, thanks, Jossie, for checking. It's fact sheet food science. That's what the FS stands for, and it's number 41.